My fiancée once told me, "You knew I had debt when you met me. It's part of the package." I thought she meant student loans. A few credit cards, maybe. But that Tuesday evening, I walked into our kitchen and found a mountain of papers. Loans, bills, debt collectors. More than I'd ever imagined. What she called part of the package was nearly $200,000 in debt. And that's when I realized maybe I didn't really know the woman I was about to marry. Welcome to Whisper Wire, where the internet's untold stories come alive. I, 32M, thought I knew everything about my fiancée when I proposed 6 months ago. We'd been together for 3 years, lived together for 2, and I genuinely believed we'd covered all the important topics couples should discuss before marriage. Money, kids, career goals, family expectations. We talked through it all during countless late-night conversations over wine and takeout. Or so I thought. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd just gotten home from work, still wearing my suit, when I found her sitting at our kitchen table with papers scattered everywhere. Bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents, a financial graveyard spread across the oak surface we'd picked out together at IKEA. She looked up at me with that expression I'd learned to recognize over the years, half defiant, half guilty. It was the same look she'd worn when she'd admitted to backing my car into a pole, or when she'd confessed to spending our vacation fund on a designer handbag she'd returned the next day. But this was different. The numbers I glimpsed on those papers made my stomach drop. She told me we needed to talk about finances before the wedding. Not the general talk we'd had before about combining accounts and setting budgets, but the real talk about her debt, the full extent of it. As she walked me through each document, the number kept climbing. Student loans from her master's degree, credit card balances that had snowballed during her period of unemployment 2 years ago, a personal loan she'd taken to help her sister with medical bills, and another loan for her car that was worth less than what she owed on it. When she finished explaining, I sat there staring at the calculator on her phone. The total was staggering. More than my annual salary, more than the down payment we'd saved for our first house, more than I'd ever imagined anyone could owe without declaring bankruptcy. I asked her why she hadn't told me about this before, why we'd made all these plans, looked at houses, talked about starting a family in a few years without me knowing we'd be starting our marriage nearly $200,000 in the hole. She got defensive immediately. She reminded me that I'd known she had some debt when we met. She'd mentioned student loans early in our relationship. She said she'd been working on paying it down, making minimum payments, doing what she could. Then came the line that burned itself into my memory. She told me I knew she had debt when I met her, and it was part of the package. If I loved her, I'd accept all of her, including her financial situation. I sat there for a long moment, processing what she'd said. Part of the package. Like her debt was equivalent to her sense of humor, or her habit of leaving coffee cups around the house. Like nearly $200,000 of financial burden was just another quirky personality trait I should embrace. I looked at her sitting across from me, arms crossed, waiting for my response, and I realized something had shifted in how I saw her. Not just the debt, though that was certainly a shock, but the way she presented it. The expectation that I should simply absorb this massive financial burden without question, because we were getting married. I told her I got it. I understood. Then I excused myself to the bedroom, saying I needed some time to process everything. What I actually did was call my college roommate, who'd become a successful attorney specializing in family law. We'd stayed close over the years, and I knew I could trust him to be honest with me about my options. The next morning, I took a personal day from work. and met him at his office downtown. He listened as I explained the situation, occasionally taking notes, asking clarifying questions about the types of debt when it was incurred and what assets we each brought to the relationship. He laid out my options clearly. In our state, debt acquired before marriage typically remains the responsibility of the person who incurred it, unless it becomes marital debt through joint accounts or refinancing. However, once we were married, her debt payments would come from our household income, affecting our ability to buy a house, save for retirement, or handle any financial emergencies. He suggested a prenuptial agreement that would clearly delineate financial responsibilities and protect both of us. He explained that prenups weren't just for millionaires trying to protect family fortunes. They were practical tools for couples entering marriage with significantly different financial situations. We spent 2 hours going through various scenarios and protections. By the time I left his office, I had a clear plan. Over the next week, I did my own research. I learned about debt-to-income ratios, how her debt would affect our ability to get approved for a mortgage, and what our monthly budget would realistically look like if we were making substantial payments toward her existing obligations. The numbers were sobering. Even if she got a modest raise and we both lived frugally, we'd be looking at 7 to 10 years of tight budgets just to get back to zero. That was 7 to 10 years of delayed home ownership, delayed family planning, and delayed financial security. But what bothered me more than the numbers was her attitude. Over the following days, she seemed to assume the conversation was closed. She'd made her declaration about the debt being part of the package. I'd said, I got it. And apparently, that meant I'd simply accepted responsibility for her financial decisions. She started talking about our wedding registry, mentioning expensive items we should add. She brought up the honeymoon destination we discussed, suggesting we upgrade to a more expensive resort. She even mentioned wanting to start looking at houses again, as if we hadn't just discovered that we were starting our marriage with a massive debt burden. I realized she genuinely expected me to absorb her financial problems without any changes to our lifestyle expectations or future plans. The debt was my problem now, but somehow that didn't extend to any adjustments in her spending or approach to money. 2 weeks after our initial conversation, my attorney called to let me know the prenuptial agreement was ready for review. He'd crafted it carefully, focusing on fairness while protecting both parties. The agreement specified that premarital debts would remain the responsibility of the person who incurred them, outlined how we'd handle joint expenses and savings goals, and established clear guidelines for major financial decisions. I reviewed the document that evening after she'd gone to bed. It was thorough but fair, designed to protect both of us while ensuring we were both equally invested in our financial future together. The next morning over coffee, I told her I'd been thinking about our financial conversation from a few weeks earlier. I said I'd realized she was right about accepting the whole package when you love someone, and that I'd taken some steps to make sure we started our marriage on solid ground. I handed her the prenuptial agreement. She initially thought it was wedding paperwork, venue contracts, or vendor agreements. But as she read through the first page, her expression changed completely. The casual smile faded, replaced by confusion, then anger. She asked me what this was supposed to mean. I explained that after our conversation about her debt being part of the package, I'd realized we needed legal clarity about our financial responsibilities. The prenup would ensure that her premarital debts remained her responsibility while protecting both of us in the marriage. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused me of being calculating and unromantic. She said the prenup meant I didn't trust her and was planning for our marriage to fail. She demanded to know why I was trying to punish her for being honest about her financial situation. I remained calm and explained that this wasn't punishment, it was protection. I told her that if her debt was truly part of her package, then she should be comfortable taking responsibility for it. The prenup simply formalized what she'd already claimed, that the debt was hers and part of who she was. She threw the documents on the table and stormed out of the kitchen. For the rest of the day, she barely spoke to me, giving me cold stares and short answers when I tried to engage her in conversation. That evening, she attempted a different approach. She sat down next to me on the couch and tried to explain that marriage meant sharing everything, the good and the bad. She said that asking her to sign a prenup was like saying I wasn't fully committed to our partnership. I listened to her carefully, then asked her a simple question. If sharing everything was so important to her, why had she waited until 6 months before our wedding to share the full extent of her debt with me? Why had she let me make financial plans and decisions based on incomplete information? She didn't have a good answer for that. Over the next few days, she tried several different tactics. She cried, saying I was making her feel ashamed of her past mistakes. She got angry, accusing me of being controlling and manipulative. She tried to bargain, suggesting we could modify the prenup to be less restrictive. But every conversation came back to the same fundamental issue. She wanted the security of marriage and shared finances without taking responsibility for the financial burden she was bringing to the relationship. A week after I presented the prenup, she called her sister to come over and help her talk sense into me. Her sister had always been supportive of our relationship, and I think my fiancé expected her to take her side automatically. The three of us sat in our living room while she explained the situation from her perspective. She painted me as someone who was suddenly changing the terms of our relationship, who was being unreasonable and unloving by asking for a prenup. But her sister surprised both of us. After listening to the full story, she asked some pointed questions about the debt. Questions I realized my fiancé had probably hoped wouldn't come up. It became clear that some of the debt wasn't just from unavoidable circumstances, like education or medical bills. There were vacations charged to credit cards, shopping sprees during her unemployment, and lifestyle choices that had contributed significantly to the total amount owed. Her sister told her that if she'd been hiding the full extent of her debt from me, then maybe she should consider why she felt the need to hide it in the first place. She said that if the debt was really just part of who she was, she should be proud to take responsibility for it in the prenup. That conversation marked a turning point. My fiancé realized that even her own family wasn't going to automatically support her position. Over the next week, she went through what seemed like the stages of grief. She tried bargaining again, suggesting we could work out payment plans or find ways to tackle the debt together without the prenup. She got angry again, accusing me of never really loving her if I couldn't accept her financial situation. She tried guilt, reminding me of all the ways she'd supported me during difficult times in our relationship. But I held firm. I told her that I did love her, which was exactly why I wanted us to start our marriage with complete honesty and clear expectations. The prenup wasn't about not accepting her debt. It was about ensuring that we were both taking responsibility for our individual financial decisions. I also pointed out something that seemed to surprise her. The prenup worked both ways. Just as her premarital debt would remain her responsibility, my assets and savings would remain protected as well. If she was truly committed to building our financial future together, this shouldn't be a problem. Finally, 2 weeks after I presented the document, she agreed to review it with her own attorney. I'd expected her to find a lawyer who would tell her the prenup was unreasonable, but apparently several attorneys she consulted told her essentially the same thing my friend had told me. Given the significant debt she was bringing to the marriage, a prenup was not only reasonable, but probably wise for both parties. Her attorney suggested a few minor modifications, to ensure the agreement was completely fair and enforceable. We worked through those changes, and both sides were satisfied with the final document. The day she signed the prenup was strange. She seemed deflated, like she'd finally accepted that her debt really was going to remain her responsibility. But there was also something else in her expression, a kind of resentment that told me she still felt like I was being unfair. That's when I realized our relationship had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just about the debt or the prenup anymore. It was about the fact that when faced with a major financial disclosure, her first instinct had been to make it my responsibility rather than taking ownership of her choices. Update 1. The wedding was still 2 months away when she signed the prenup, but the dynamic between us had shifted dramatically. She seemed to be going through the motions of wedding planning without any real enthusiasm. When people asked her about wedding details, she'd give short answers and change the subject. I started paying attention to other aspects of our relationship that I'd previously overlooked. Her approach to money wasn't just about the debt she'd hidden. It was about a pattern of financial decisions that prioritized immediate gratification over long-term planning. She'd order expensive takeout when we had food in the refrigerator. She'd buy new clothes instead of wearing things she already owned. She'd suggest expensive date activities when we were supposed to be saving money. I realized that while I'd been focused on the big debt revelation, I'd missed the smaller signs that we had fundamentally different approaches to money and responsibility. 3 weeks before the wedding, she brought up the idea of a joint credit card for wedding expenses. She suggested we could put the remaining vendor payments and honeymoon costs on a card that we'd pay off together after the wedding. I reminded her about the financial boundaries we'd established in the prenup. If she wanted to charge wedding expenses, she was welcome to do so on her own credit, but I wouldn't be taking joint responsibility for additional debt. That conversation led to our biggest fight yet. She accused me of being petty and controlling, of using the prenup to manipulate her into paying for things that should be shared expenses. She said I was treating our wedding like a business transaction instead of a celebration of our love. I tried to explain that the wedding expenses were exactly the kind of financial decisions we needed to make carefully. We'd agreed on a budget months earlier, and if she wanted to exceed that budget, she needed to take responsibility for the additional costs. But as we argued, I realized something that had been nagging at me for weeks. I no longer trusted her financial judgment. Every spending suggestion she made, every financial conversation we had, I found myself wondering what she wasn't telling me or what problem she was trying to solve by spending money we didn't have. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship was gone, and I wasn't sure it could be rebuilt. Update 2. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called off the engagement. It wasn't just about the debt, though that had been the catalyst. It was about realizing that we had fundamentally incompatible approaches to honesty, responsibility, and financial planning. The prenup had solved the legal problem of protecting my assets, but it couldn't solve the deeper relationship problem of rebuilding trust. The conversation was devastating for both of us. She cried and begged me to reconsider, promising she'd be more responsible with money, more honest about financial decisions, more committed to our shared goals. But I'd already seen how she handled financial stress and responsibility, and I didn't think marriage was going to change those fundamental patterns. I told her that I loved her, but I couldn't marry someone I didn't trust to be honest with me about important decisions. The debt wasn't the real problem. The hiding and the expectation that I should simply absorb the consequences of her choices was the problem. She moved out of our apartment the following week. We had to cancel the wedding, return gifts, and deal with all the practical complications of ending an engagement so close to the wedding date. It was expensive and emotionally exhausting. But as I handled each cancellation and refund, I kept thinking about how much more complicated and expensive it would have been to get divorced a few years down the line. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that she'd met someone new and was already talking about moving in together. I wondered if she'd been upfront about her debt this time, or if her new boyfriend was going to get the same surprise I'd gotten. I also heard that she'd been telling people that I'd called off the wedding because I couldn't accept her past, that I'd been shallow and unsupportive when she'd been honest about her financial struggles. That bothered me at first, but I realized that her version of events was probably the only way she could make sense of what had happened. She genuinely seemed to believe that hiding nearly $200,000 of debt until 6 months before the wedding was just normal relationship disclosure, and that my request for a prenup was an overreaction. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that conversation we had about her debt being part of the package. It forced both of us to be clear about our expectations and boundaries. She expected me to absorb her financial problems without question. I expected honesty and shared responsibility. Neither of us was wrong for having those expectations, but we were definitely wrong for each other. The prenup had been my way of protecting myself financially, but it ended up protecting me in a much more important way. It showed me exactly who I was planning to marry and what our marriage would have looked like. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting back at someone who wronged you. Sometimes it's just refusing to let them make their problems into your problems. I kept the lawyer's number, though. Thanks for listening to Whisper Wire. Remember, sometimes the scariest whispers aren't from strangers online. They're from the ones you thought you knew best. Don't forget to subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see love, trust, and truth.